Welcome to my series of basketball videos where I'll be comparing various NBA grades against each other. I'm doing this because I find that a lot of the basketball videos comparing players on YouTube are too focused on the big names, and sometimes compare players from different positions. For example, lots of people compare Jordan to LeBron and Kobe to Duncan, just because of their similar levels of achievements, but since those players play different positions and have different styles of play, it's not an interesting comparison. In this series, I want to do a comparison not between just more well-known players, but players from days past, in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and even the ABA as well, that most modern fans probably do not have too much knowledge about. Also, as much as possible, I want to compare players that play similar positions and have similar play styles. To me, that's a more interesting and fruitful comparison. I'll be using 6 different metrics to compare each player. The first category is scoring. This category will be defined by each player's career points per game, peak points per game both in the regular season and playoffs, and number of scoring titles. Rebounding. This category will be defined by each player's career rebounds per game, peak rebounds per game both in the regular season and playoffs, and number of rebounding titles. Passing. This category will be defined by each player's career assists per game, peak assists per game both regular season and playoffs, and number of assist titles. Efficiency and advanced metrics. This category will be defined by each player's career true shooting percentage per and win shares per 48, both in the regular season and playoffs. The reason I use true shooting percentage is because it's more fair to guards. Field goal percentage tends to be biased to big men because of their height and play style closer to the basket. I also put in win shares per 48 here because it encompasses efficiency along with other attributes to give you an idea of how many wins a player contributes to his team. Defense. This category will be defined by each player's all defensive selections, defensive win shares, and defensive player of the year awards. The reason I'm not using blocks and steals in this comparison is because I want to compare the achievements of older players that modern fans might not have too much knowledge about, and players in the 1960s and early 1970s do not have steals and blocks tracked. Awards. This category will be defined by All-Star appearances, All-NBA selections, MVPs, Finals MVPs, and championships as the first, second, or third best player. The reason I have to only count championships as a top 3 player on the team is because otherwise, you get into the situation where, for example, Robert Horry has 7 rings and Karl Malone has 0. And it's not representative of how much better a player is if they weren't a top 3 player on their team contributing to a championship. I know including All-Star selections is a little bit controversial because it's fan-voted, but ultimately, this is what the Hall of Fame uses in their criteria to induct a player, as unfair as it sounds. Also, I'll be including ABA stats and awards and using them as equivalent to their respective NBA stats and awards. The only one that's different about the ABA is that instead of Finals MVP, they have Playoffs MVP, which honestly is a better idea than Finals MVP since it accounts for the whole playoffs, but just to keep it simple, I'll be referring to the ABA Playoffs MVP as Finals MVP here. Also, no All-NBA third team selections are counted, because All-NBA third teams weren't added until the late 80s, which is unfair to older players. Also, I'm not using any career total stats because that's a longevity thing. For example, no one would say that Karl Malone was a better scorer than Michael Jordan, even though he has more total points. And of course, this is only going to be my opinion from comparing the available metrics, since I have not watched most of these players live, or even been born when some of these players have been playing. And to keep it fair, I'm judging them based on how they did in their own era. No time travel or what if this NBA player played in today's era or the 1960s, none of that. I'll be strictly basing their stats and accomplishments within their own era against that era's competition, which makes the most sense to me. So I hope you guys enjoy this comparison video and hopefully learn something new from it. The 17th episode in the series looks at 2 all-time shooting guards for contemporaries. Both played on the second Dream Team together in 1996, and both were Hall of Famers known for their great offensive abilities. Reggie Miller is best known as an Indiana Pacers legend, an incredible shooter and clutch player whose mentality and trash-talking made him a lot of fans, despite never winning a ring in his career. Mitch Richmond, on the other hand, was a more low-key player who simply put in the offensive numbers night after night for both the Golden State Warriors and the Sacramento Kings, but did not experience much playoff success in his prime. But who had the overall greater career? Let's find out. In the scoring category, it's very close, as both players were offensive superstars in their prime, with Miller averaging 18.2 points per game for his career, peaking at 24.6 points per game in 1990, and upped his game to 20.6 points per game in the playoffs, peaking at an incredible 31.5 points per game in 1993. Richmond averaged 21 points per game for his career, peaking at 25.9 points per game in 1997, and 19.5 points per game in the playoffs, peaking at 22.3 points per game in 1991. This is pretty tough because although Richmond averaged consistently higher numbers for his career, he didn't up his game in the playoffs the same way Miller did. In addition, it has to be noted that Miller played alongside other offensive stars on his team like Rick Smits and Jalen Rose, whereas Richmond was the main scorer on the Sacramento Kings for most of his career and thus took more shots. So Richmond may have the better numbers at first glance, but it's deceiving, and I think in actuality their scoring abilities are much closer than it looks. I may have to say Richmond for the regular season and Miller for crunch time in the playoffs. Thus for this category I have to call it a tie. In the rebounding category, I think it's clear to see that Richmond was a better rebounder here, not just by the numbers, but also considering the fact that Miller was actually the taller player here. Miller was not a very good rebounder for his size, averaging only 3 rebounds per game for his career, peaking at 3.9 a game in 1989-1992, and 2.9 boards a game in the playoffs, peaking at 5 a game in 2001. Richmond, on the other hand, despite being shorter than Miller, was more athletic and averaged 3.9 rebounds per game for his career, which is the same as Miller's peak, peaking at a more substantial 5.9 rebounds a game in 1989-1991. In the playoffs, he averaged Miller's playoffs peak at 5.3 rebounds per game, peaking at 7.3 a game in 1989. Richmond was clearly the more athletic player and more dominant on the boards here, so this category easily goes to him. In the passing category, Miller averaged 3 assists per game for his career, peaking at 4 per game in 1991, and 2.5 assists per game in the playoffs, peaking at 4.7 a game in 1992. For Richmond, he averaged a higher 3.5 assists per game for his career, peaking at 5.1 a game in 1992, and 3 assists per game in the playoffs, peaking at 4.4 a game in 1989. Richmond was the better distributor here as he consistently averaged higher numbers than Miller and was more of the offensive focal point for his team, whereas distributing was not one of Miller's main roles for his team. Thus, I'm giving this category to The Rock. In the efficiency and advanced metrics category, while Richmond was a good shooter in his own right and also more offensively versatile than Miller, able to penetrate and attack the basket in a number of ways and able to posterize people on dunks in a way Miller could not, it's not a close comparison as Miller was one of the most efficient shooters ever and probably second only to Steph Curry when it comes to his true shooting percentage amongst guards. While his PER is a bit more similar to Richmond's, his win shares per 48 also blows Richmond away, and thus I'll have to give this category to Miller. In the defense category, I would say this is a close call. Although Miller has more defensive win shares, he also played 400 more games than Richmond did. Neither player had any all-defensive selections, and it can be considered slight liabilities on the defensive end. I would say this category will have to be a tie, as neither player is renowned for any aspect on the defensive end. In the awards category, both players had a similar number of All-Star selections, but Richmond has 3 All-NBA second-team selections compared to 0 for Miller. Miller only had All-NBA third-team selections, which I do not count in these comparison videos. In addition, I have to mention that although Richmond has a championship, it was coming off the bench for the Shaq-Kobe Lakers, and thus I do not count that one. In their primes, neither player won a championship, although Miller had far more success with his Pacers teams, going to an NBA Finals in 2000, playing with Mark Jackson, Jalen Rose, and Rick Smits. Richmond had his best playoff success early in his career with the Run TMC Warriors, consisting of himself, Chris Mullin, who by the way ended up being a teammate of Miller's later on, and Tim Hardaway. Unfortunately with the Kings, Richmond never had the teammates to make a very deep playoff run. Overall though, just going off the All-NBA selections, I'll have to give this advantage to Richmond here. So when all the categories are summed up, Richmond takes the rebounding, passing, and awards categories, Miller takes the efficiency category with the rest being a tie, giving Mitch Richmond the win. Reggie Miller is rightfully known as one of the greatest shooters of all time, an Indiana Pacers legend, as well as a clutch playoff performer, elevating his game in the playoffs, although he never quite reached the promised land. Mitch Richmond was a very versatile offensive player who was able to shoot, penetrate, and dunk, and is most known for his stints as part of the Golden State Warriors and Sacramento Kings, although he never experienced as much playoff success in his career as Miller did. It's interesting that the NBA decided that Reggie Miller was worthy of inclusion on their 75th anniversary team, but Mitch Richmond was not, but it's likely due to Miller's status as a loyal Pacers legend and experiencing much more playoff success than Richmond did. It could be said that Richmond was the overall more talented superstar, but Miller had more career success. Hope you guys enjoyed this comparison. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next comparison video.